Okay, good morning. We are on page 165 in Hemshech Tzadik Daled. And Friedrich Rebbe, who's developing and elaborating on Ayin Beis, volume 2 of page 1158, which we are actually learning, but this is an explanation of it, is discussing at length with different examples and different forms of manifestation of three levels of, you can call it, of evolution, of Eir. How Eir, energy, evolves. What he calls three madregas, three levels in Eiris. One, the way Eir is encompassed, energy, the divine Ayin, the Emtza, that is encompassed within the source. So there the focus is on the source. There's one how it emerges from the source, and now there is, but that was, first one was called Metzius, existence. It just exists, and we defined its existence as non-existent really, because it's not yet in any form expressed in any particular way. All it is an expression of the source. The second is called Kiyum, that he calls is already a Kiyum, Kayom and Bitsir Mefurit. It takes on some form of definition, but it's still relatively shapeless in the sense it's not yet fully developed. And the third is Gilui, is how the Eir becomes actual, what he calls spheres, 10 specific spheres, each one in their location, Eiris Bekalim. In level 2, it's Eiris that have some form and shape, but as he's called them, Esu spheres blima, without substance. So there you have the three levels. And he used the words Eiris HaKolul, then comes the Eir Ha, that comes, expresses itself, Metzius Kiyum and Gilui. Now he introduced what we learned yesterday is another expression that this in general are the three levels called Nekudah, Kav, and Shetach. A point, Nekudah, it all begins with a point. A Kav is a line, so there's length, there's extension, but no width. And Shetach is a plane, there's also length and width. So he explained the difference. Nekudah is just a concentrated point that he calls as Lamaila She'ein Ba Adayin Hispashtus Erech V'Rechev. It doesn't yet have any extension and expansion in length or width. And the words he uses afterwards was that Hakol B'Pshitus Adayin. Everything is still in a very unshaped form. He calls it Hubchinas Ha'atzmus. The Kud is called the core. Shalamayla Adayim B'chinas Hamshacha V'Gili. That's still higher than beyond transmission and revelation. The Kav is already a revelation because it's extending, like a Vav. And then he explained that there are two ways of explaining the Kav. One is that you're taking the Nekudah and you bring it down to a student or to someone on a lower level through examples and through explanation, but it's all that Nekudah. The second way is that you dissect that Nekudah, that point, and you reveal the details within it, which seems to be the main thing he wants to really discuss, the second Eifin. But both are there. And as he said, the first Eifin is the Kav. It's a Gili Proti Mugbal that brings it down. And the second one is that it's going into the Nekudah and drawing out the details of it. And it says that's why the Kav is also made up of Nekudahs. Kav Osim in Nekudahs, because the Kav still, in the first Eifin, you could say it's not necessarily, it's already coming into more of an expression of definitions. In the second Eifin, it's more still Nekudahs, but it's now Nekudahs that are furthermore developed, but not fully yet. So that's the second Eifin. So he explains, this is the difference between Teresh B'Ksav and Mishnah and Gemara. Torah Shebiksav, everything is still in Nekudah. B'kitzur b'Nekudah. In the Mishnah, it brings out Megalim Prote HaNekudah. But the Mishnah can still be relatively cryptic. Then comes the Gemara, and that fleshes it out into details. So everything begins with a Nekudah in the pasuk, in the Torah Shebiksav. Then it's developed a little more in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah sounds like the second Eifin. The Mishnah is not about bringing it down to a student with examples. The Mishnah is going into the Nekudah of the written Torah and fleshing it out a bit more. Yeah. But it's still Pshittus. And then comes the Gemara that develops it. So it seems like the Gemara would be Shetach. Torah Shebiksav would be Nekudah, Mishnah would be Kav, and the Gemara would be Shetach, the plane, with his Eirech and Rechev. Not just developing and dissecting the details of the Nekudah, but also expanding on them. Okay, that's what we learned. Now we're going to continue. It's not over yet. This subject matter. So we're on page 165. So we learned what line? So we learned Hasgas. I'll just read quickly, even though we read it already. Just sum quickly, so it doesn't hurt to go through it quickly. On top of page, I'm going to start from line 4. So after saying that Torah Shebiksav, every mitzvah Kamei Torah Shebiksav b'kitzav and Nekudah, it's brief and concentrated in one point. HaMishnayos say Megalim Prote HaNekudah. The Mishnayos reveal the details. So now, the difference between these two Eifanim in Kav. He says like this. We read this, but I'll just read it quickly. The difference between these two approaches, these two ways of explaining what the line, the extension does in regard to the Nekudah, the point. He says, the Be'efana Aleph, Kav and Gilui Prati Mugbal Kamei Shabav V'Yedid Medarga V'Darga Ad Sheyuchel Iskabel L'Bal Seichel Kotten B'Yeser. In the first approach, the first Eifen, the first type of explaining that Kav, basically, the Kav draws down and reveals Yes, it reveals the specific and defined detail, whatever that Nekudah was, in a way that comes down level to the point that it could be understood by someone of lesser knowledge or intelligence. So you're not talking about developing it and let's expand on it, all the different aspects of it. We're taking the Nekudah, whatever that Nekudah is. So let's say it says in Chumash, it says, let's just take an example. It says, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, Asher Yitzisichem Eretz Mitzrayim, the first of the 10 commandments. That's a Nekudah. What the teacher would do, or the mashpia would take that and explain it well to a student. You're not developing what it means and all the angles of it and aspects of it. You're explaining what that means in a way that someone can understand. So that's a kav. It's a gilui of that prat. It says the mitzvah to keep Shabbos. Explain that to a child. What is Shabbos? You're not going to all the hilchas Shabbos and all the halachas and so on. The second Eifin, on the other hand, he says, Eifin HaBeis, even though it's a kav that's erech, which means there's only length, extension without width, breadth. But it's not just a kav that's drawing. In the first eifin, it would be just essentially like a pipe from Anoichi Hashem Elokecha to the student to explain what that means or what Shabbos is. Now it's a kav that's made up of details as well. It's made up of more of nekudas. Because what is it doing? Even though it's a kav that reveals the details of that original point, so now the Mishnah doesn't just take Anechi Hashem Elokecha or whatever pasuk and just explains it. The Mishnah breaks it down into further details. So now you have not just you're explaining one point, you're dissecting all the details. And at the same time, however, they still remain somewhat bepshitus, somewhat shapeless, still not fully spelled out, like the details in the Mishnah. So Mishnah is not just bringing the pasuk down to a student that's on a lower level. The Mishnah actually breaks it apart into more details, into more nekudas, I should say, more points. Hagam shem is galus on nekudah the Teresh B'Ksav, even though relatively to Teresh B'Ksav it's revealing the nekudah, the point in the written Torah. Avol gam hem pshutim adayim, they're still shapeless. Asher zeu ashak v'tayr, then comes, for this purpose, it comes the deliberation and the back and forth and discussion and debates. Basvoros shabegemara, in the theories in the Gemara, lahagbil haprotim amavorim ba'mishnah, lahagbil, to define and to channel and to explain the details that are explained in the Mishnah. V'hainu, this means the chol haprotim hariyeshrim k'moshe klulim ba'nekudah. All these details are there as they are encompassed in the initial nekudah, in the initial point. V'akav megala haprotim, and the kav is megala those details. So in the first eifin, it's not megala the details within the nekudah. It just takes the nekudah and draws it down like a line, like a pipe, to explain it. Where here, now we're talking about the Mishnah is more than that. It's actually megala haprotim, aval im zeh ne haprotim hamizgalim adei kav osim and nekudas hem b'pshitusan adayim. And yet, these details that it's revealing through the kav are made up of, which is made up of nekudas, more points, more. They're still b'pshitusan. So the Mishnah has accomplished much. The Mishnah has now laid out a framework of what the pasuk means, and the Gemara now can develop this framework. So when you look at Mishnah, you definitely get more than you have in the pasuk. The Mishnah will spell out even halachas and statements and essentially axioms that now will then further be developed in the Gemara, and that would be, he doesn't say it yet, Shetach, but that would be Shetach. Umekol mokim, hari einem b'deima la'pshita shel hapratim k'may shem b'nekudah. That's where we stopped. So now he says, still the Mishnah, even though relative to the Gemara is still somewhat poshut, meaning still not fully shaped, but you cannot compare the pshitus in the Mishnah in the Kav that's made up of nekudas k'may shem to the way they are when they was first initially in the first initial spark or concentrated point. And now he's going to explain what that means, what's the meaning behind it. V'yuven zeh, and this will be understood al derech moshel, like with an example, chacham gadol shu mufla b'chachma, an example of a chacham gadol, a great wise person. Great wise. Mufla b'chachma. He says, his wisdom is awesome. Mufla means awesome, wondrous, remarkable. Harimevenu maskil, he comprehends and maskil and conceives. B'chol dover chachma b'afshata shaba. Every idea, every piece of wisdom, he understands in its abstract form. In other words, not just how it manifests in a specific wisdom, he understands like the soul of the idea, like what's driving it. That's what a Chacham Gadol is. I've explained, for example, that Agachover's style is a very good example for this, where he strips halacha from its details and gets what the real argument here, or what's the real reasoning behind it. And you come away with a reasoning that does not deal with an actual halacha. Let's say the famous Machlekes Shammai and Hillel. Well, this is actually not Agachover only, but I'll give that example. Shammai and Hillel disagree in many different matters. And then we're told it's l'shitosayu, it's l'shitose. Each one has an approach. Shammai goes more basar koyach. He usually looks more at the potential of something. And Hillel goes by the actual. So if you see the potential, for example, Rosh Chodesh Shvat is the beginning of the budding in Israel of the season, of the spring season. So though it hasn't fully budded, Shammai says that's Rosh Hashanah Leilanis. That's Rosh Hashanah. Hillel says, no, you have to wait till you actually see it expressed. Not just know that it's beginning to bud and has the potential. The 15th of 15 days later is when you actually can perceive it in actuality. And therefore, Tu B'Shvat is the Rosh Hashanah Leilanis. Shammai says, since Hanukkah's miracle, on day one, really potentially, now this flame, this oil that could only burn for 1 day is going to burn 8 days, even though it didn't burn yet. But because it potentially, we know from the miracle that it will, you light 8 candles. Basar koyach. The koyach defines that now you light 8 because it will ultimately burn it. Hillel says, no, you have to go by poil. But poil mamish, it's day one. You don't yet know about the others. So therefore, it's not potential. It goes by the actual. You light 1 first day and 8 the last day. You go on and on, different places. So someone who can derive from Shammai and Hillel's arguments, this idea, koyach and poil, is like an example of the hafshata of the idea. Because if you look at the halacha, what does one thing have to do? What does Rosh Hashanah for the trees have to do with Hanukkah? And their disagreement seems like a completely different issue. There they're talking about the harvest, spring season. This is talking about the miracle. But when you are able to so-called strip it from the details, Hafshat is essentially stripping it from the manifestation of the idea and seeing it more, what's the core issue here? In a way, it's like the difference between symptoms and roots. You see somebody behave a certain way, you're seeing the symptoms. A Chacham Gadol can see, 1 second, there's something going on here behind the scenes. But to do that, you need Hafshata. The opposite of Hafshata, just for the record, in Hebrew is Halbosha. Halbosha is the art of dressing it up in examples, in details, expressing it. Hafshat is the process of undressing it and stripping it from the details and getting to the core idea. So both are necessary. Halbasha obviously is necessary when you want to really understand it well and you want to explain it to somebody. But Hafshata is getting to the core essence of the idea. So he says, a Chacham Gadol is he understands it all in the stripped state, like stripping it away from all the specifics and getting to whatever the kernel, the essential core of the idea is. And this is true in every area, by the way. This could be true of medicine and economics. Wherever you go, there's that ability to be able to look at really what's going on in its purest form. Ubefrat mi shekol iker hisaskuse b'muskolis hu b'seichel mufshet. So this is just a general statement of a Chacham Gadol. Specifically, the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying there's also a type of person, his ikir is haskuska, his main preoccupation, b'muskolis, in intelligence, in ideas, is b'seichel mufshet. That's his main preoccupation. The Ragachover is an example for that. So every Chacham Gadol is able to do so, but then there's individuals that this is their primary preoccupation, their primary involvement when they develop ideas, is their focus on Seichel Mufshet, meaning on abstract. It's a little like Lahavdil, the difference between theoretical physics and practical physics. The theoretical is more understanding so-called what's going on in the core theories of it, not so much the empirical or the mechanical side of it. Not that it minimizes that. It's just two different ways of looking at it. So a person whose primary preoccupation is Seichel Mufshet. ukanal, like we discussed earlier, by hefresh the chochmas hamaisa v'chochmas hanefesh. So on the previous page, he said the difference between wisdom of craftsmanship, of a craft, of something that's action related, and chochmas hanefesh, wisdom of the soul or wisdom of the psyche, shehem gdorim yuchodim dal boshev afshota. They are, he's introducing now another point there. They're gdorim, they're specific parameters. Specific, gdorim would be, gdorim literally means boundaries. Gdorim means parameters, gdorim. The halboshev afshota. In other words, chochmas ha'maisa, it seems he's saying, is more halbosha, chochmas ha'nefesh is more afshota, or shehem gdorim yuchodim dal boshev afshota. So Frierdiker Rebbe is more abstract language. I think he's saying that they are the Gedorim Yuchadim, that one is more halbosha. Chochmas HaMaisa, obviously, is far more tangible. And Chochmas HaNefesh is far more abstract. Or B'Chochmas HaNefesh Gufa, and the wisdom of the soul, meaning wisdom of the nefesh, wisdom of the psyche itself, Ma'ayin be'emek chochmosei be'inyan HaNefesh b'metzius muhusei v'loy b'muhus metziusei. The Frierdiker Rebbe, this is the Frierdiker Rebbe's favorite expressions, muhus metzius, metzius muhus. So let's take this slowly. I wanted to add one thing which I think I missed. When he said that he said, remember, he said, a chacham gadol, who's someone who sees in everything the hafshata, the abstract element of it, especially someone whose primary preoccupation. So I think when he says chachmas ha-nefesh and chachmas ha-maisa, he's saying that's his primary preoccupation, chachmas ha-nefesh. So he's involved more in general with more abstract stuff than tangible. In chachmas ha-nefesh itself, this person whose preoccupation, this psychologist, if you wish, or this soul doctor, as opposed to a more of a craftsman, Ma'ayin, he delves into be'emek chachmosei, be'inyan hanefesh, as that itself is also levels. I want to correct also another thing. I don't know, maybe a different way to interpret. When he said chachmas ha'maisa, chachmas ha'nefesh, first I said one is more halbosha, one is more hafshata. I think he's also saying that shehem gedorim yuchadim, that each one of them has probably both. And they have different gedorim depending. It's not clear whether he means one is halbosha, more halbosha, one is hafshata, or is he saying that they both have their different gedorim in halbosha and hafshata itself. So for example, chachmas hanefesh is obviously more hafshata. Could be he's also saying that. Now he's going further, that a chachmas hanefesh itself, this person who's involved in it, he digs deeper, he probes deeper, because in the nefesh itself, you could have different ways of understanding. For example, you could talk about behavioral psychology, which is a form of nefesh, but it's more focused on the behavior. You can go deeper into the more deeper forces inside. So he says his focus is on the metzius of the muhus of the nefesh, and not the muhus of the metzius of the nefesh. Now let's just refresh what that means before I read on. Remember, everything has muhus and metzius. Metzius is the parameters and definitions and expression of something. In Tov Shin Aleph, I mentioned that's how he defines it. Muhus is more than mahu. It's eichus, it's quality. Like, what is it made of? Not its form of expression. So everything is muhus and metzius. So if you think in general, someone asks, who are you? Your muhus would be your neshama, and your metzius would be your body in general. But then there's a muhus and metzius within the muhus, and a muhus metzius within the metzius. The body also has a muhus. The muhus of the body, what is it made of? And the neshama also has a metzius. How does it express itself? So everything has a muhus hamahus. There's four then: mahus hamahus, metzius hamahus, mahus hametzius, and metzius hametzius. Obviously, we always begin from the bottom up with metzius hametzius. What is the expression of the outer form of this idea? And then you move to mahus hametzius. So he's saying this so-called soul doctor looks deeper, and not just looking at the mitzvus of the metzius of the nefesh, which be like what the forces behind his expression, but looks more into the expression of what are the forces within of the inner soul, so to speak, the inner dimensions of the soul. Mahus HaMahus obviously is the most elusive because it's the most abstract and most beyond us. But that's what he defines here. So in other words, to just give an example back to the artist, if we were to analyze a piece of art, that's the metzius, the product of the artist. So you could analyze the art. What does it mean? What's the message, etc. So you're doing the art, you're doing basically the metzius of the metzius would be the art itself. The mahusa metzius would be trying to understand what was the driving force behind making this art. Once you get to understanding the artist himself, that's already the mahus. The artist is the mahus of this metzius. And here too, you can talk about the metzius of the mahus. What drove the artist to make this art? That would be the metzius of the mahus. So you're analyzing more the creator, the producer, than the product. So if you're analyzing the product, that's in the world of metzius. And there itself, there's a metzius of metzius, mahus of metzius. Metzius would be even the mechanism he used. For example, what colors were used, what tools were used. It's more like dissecting the metzius of it. Mahusa metzius is more what's driving it. Once you get to the artist in this example, the artist also has a metzius hamahus would be, why did the artist choose to express this? And you find out he went through a very traumatic experience and that caused him to make this art. That would be metzius of the mahus. You're analyzing more the nefesh as opposed to its expression. And then, because mahus obviously would be going into the deepest parts of what that artist is like, which is not really addressing here. So point being here that this chacham who goes to Hafshata, in that itself there's levels. He just explained the level of metzius hamahus compared to mahus metzius. So he says like this now. The mahus metzius, the mahus of metzius zeu kamoishu biyaches ala keches. So now he's talking back to the keches hanefesh. If you remember, he spoke about the keches hanefesh with seichel, chochmes ha-nefesh, chochmes ha-maisa. 1 second, let me just see something. Okay, so Mahusa Metzius, he says, is more as it relates to the faculties. What does that mean? He explains, Ukanal, in his bar lil rather. And it was explained earlier on page 163 at the top. If you remember about Evri Haguf and Evri HaNefesh. So what was explained? The benefesh hine akeches hem Evri HaNefesh. Just as the body has limbs and organs, the soul also has components. In nefesh, the faculties are called the components, or you can call the limbs, quote unquote, of the soul. Bedugmas Evri Haguf, similar to like in the body, the limbs of the body. V'shayich be milo mata, and you can discuss milo mata. There's higher faculties, there's lower faculties. Remember there we spoke about, just like the body has the flesh of the brain is superior to the flesh on the heel of the foot, and yet they're both part of the body. The same thing with the nefesh. He said, Chochmes ha-maisa. What was the expression he used there? Chochmes ha-tenua, sorry. Keich ha-tenua. The power of movement doesn't require much effort, is lower than the power of intelligence, which needs effort, yigia. So he says there's milo mata. That's what we discussed. Aval metzius muhusei, that's metzius, that's muhusa metzius. So muhusa metzius means you're talking about the actual faculties of the soul, and you're saying what's the muhusa of those faculties? Let's say the power of movement is lower than the power of intelligence. That's what would be Muhus HaMetzius in the world of faculties. Or is he saying that Tenuah is more like Metzius of Metzius and Chacham is more Muhus HaMetzius? Let me look for a second. No, it doesn't sound like that. No. Keiches hem Eved HaNefesh. Yeah, Muhus Metzius means you're. Let's see what he says on Metzius Muhus. Maybe that'll help. Aval Metzius Muhusei hu l'mayla misachusei ala keiches. When you're looking at the Metzius of the Muhus, it's above and beyond its relationship to the faculties. V'hu seichel mufshet, and that is a abstract idea. Trying to understand what he means exactly in regard to what we learned earlier. Faculties. I think my initial take on it sounds the right way. I can't say 100%. I have to study it a little more because the Frierdiker Rebbe is not spelling it all out exactly. What it sounds like he's saying, like I gave the example with the artist, that when you're talking about analyzing the faculties, even of the soul, you're talking about the muhus of the Metzius. Metzius would be the body probably, and the faculties would be the faculties of the soul, but it's the muhus of the Metzius. So you're discussing the faculties, the difference between, like I said, the power of movement, the power of intelligence. However, when you go to Mahus, Metzius HaMahus, he's saying it's not about the faculties. If you remember, we learned there, it's about there's something that equalizes them. They're both faculties of the nefesh. You're talking more about the nefesh than about the keiches. That's what I think he's saying. So if you're talking about the faculties, you're talking more Mahus HaMetzius. If you're talking in relation to the faculties, I should say, you're talking about Mahus HaMetzius. Yeah. If you're talking about the nefesh, then he says you're going, it's not as it relates to faculties. What that means is not 100% clear here. I think he means the nefesh as it's beyond faculties. That's probably what he's saying. And that's a seichel mufshet because you're not defining it with any specifics, in this case, the faculties. I think that's what he's saying. But I'll review it again. If I have more to say, I'll add to it. But let me just go here. Now he explains. Remember, all of this is coming to explain a mashal for the difference between the hafshata of the Nekudah and the hafshata of a kav. They both are somewhat stripped of the real details that you get in the Gemara, but there's a difference between Mishnah and Teresh B'Ksav. That's what he's coming to explain. And as usual, the explanations of the Frierdiker Rebbe are hafshatadik themselves. They're quite abstract themselves, but often after we finish, we understand from the example, we can understand, so far Mishnah and Gemara, Teresh B'Ksav, Mishnah and Gemara seem to be more understandable than this. But this is meant to help us understand the hafshata shabazeh. So we'll soon get to it. We've already experienced it before when he went through the whole koyach hatanua, and at the end we realized what he's coming to say. So it's not, you have to look at the whole package here. So the Frierdiker Rebbe continues and says, now what's the gedder of mufshit? He's going to explain now when something is mufshit as opposed to halbosha. If it's manifesting and being explained, so then everything has its location. Let's take the koiches hanefesh. Remember, Eidus and Kalim. If you're going to talk about, let's say, the power of vision in the eye, it's very specific. There's a lot of chachma there. Optometrists it's a wisdom, the wisdom of understanding the anatomy and the whole makeup of the eye and the nerve, the optic nerve, and all the details. But you're speaking about something that's very, at the end of the day, it's tangible to the point you can dissect it, you can even touch it and measure it. But if you start talking about, let's say, the power of vision in the soul before it travels to the optic nerve, in the brain, where does the optic nerve connect to the brain? Now you're dealing with something far less tangible. So even though later research in the last years has helped us understand different parts of the brain that are functioning, let's say when you see something or hear something or the different ways we process information, but it's already dealing much more abstract. Now, if you go into the nefesh, not even the brain. You go into the nefesh. Where's the koyach hariyah in the nefesh? That's already you're dealing with very much hafshata, because you're not going to find if you can't. First of all, we can't see a soul, and even if you could, you can't dissect the soul and say, okay, let me operate on it, or let me open it up under a microscope and check it out. It's far more abstraction, just as it is with subatomic particles compared to actual elements. Water, we all can touch and feel. Then you're told it's made up of molecules. The molecule of hydrogen, 2 parts of hydrogen, 1 part of oxygen. Even hydrogen and oxygen can be measured. But then when you start getting into molecules being made up of atomic particles, and atom is made up of subatomic particles, like we spoke, zeros and ones, before they become a language that ultimately becomes an interface that we can touch letters on a keyboard and you see something on a screen. The fact of the matter is, the deeper you go inward, the more hafshata it is. And what he's going to explain now is that the distinction is that the further out you go, the more defined it is. The further in you go, the less defined, and therefore you can't even distinguish between details. Like can you really see, even in the brain is a small brain, can you actually say that the power of vision is just this physical place and no other parts of the brain? Not that simple. And other functions. When you go into the nefesh, you can't say, okay, this part of the nefesh is designated to vision. This part of the nefesh is designated to hearing. This part of the nefesh is designated to chachma, to bina, to das, to chesed, to gvura. You can't do that. Because there it's all, what he used the word hiyuli. It's far more in a very amorphous, like a nebula, like a soup, where it hasn't yet defined itself. It's actually very similar when you read cosmology today and you see about the Big Bang. They all talk about everything began like a soup, everything concentrated like in a soup-like form until it slowly separated and started solidifying and becoming different planets or different stars, etc., and expanding, etc. So in a way, what he's getting to is that hafshata means details become less defined, and therefore things are very much more in an amorphous place. That's what he's going to be saying now. That's what the seichel mufshat is. So he said, who's seichel mufshat? V'ageder the seichel mufshat, the very parameter and definition of an abstract idea, who the Beis sichlim, him hofchim, gam hofchim yichelim lisarav. That 2 ideas, even opposites, including opposites, can be mixed together. That cannot happen in halbasha. When you dress it up, it's either this or that. Like Shammai and Hillel, as they heard the ideas from Shmai Vavtalyon. One was machmir, one was mekel. One was more severe, one was more stringent, one was more lenient. But when you go backwards to the hafshata of it, 2 ideas, even including opposites, can be mixed together. At the same time, even though abstract ideas can be joined, can mix together, that still does not mean there's no details. It just means it's in a state where things are still not defined completely. But together with that, he says, each one of the ideas, the conflicting ideas, has its own particular details. So at that point, that's not obvious yet, but it will become obvious. And so now he's going back to the mashal, the chacham, that can go into hafshata, into this abstract state. He says like this, Hini kasher chacham. He's going back to the image. Remember, the mashal was about this wise person, a chacham gadol, who's able to see the abstract idea within everything, especially someone whose primary involvement is that. And everything he said about chachmas hanefesh, chachmas hamaisa, and all that we spoke about is all in understanding the Metzius hamahus, mahus hametzius, Metzius hamahus. So now he's going back to the chacham. This chacham, mufla, hinikasher chacham mufla, this wondrous, this awesome, wise one, yigala hamuskalahu, will reveal that idea, k'moishu etzlei, the way he understands it. If he were to reveal what he is getting in that hafshatadika abstract state, harigam haprotim sheba muskel hem pshutim adayin, bipshitus hanekudah, kipshitus hanekudah. So if for argument's sake, you could get the Chacham to talk about how he understands this hafshata dikin. I talk about, let's say, the Ragat Shover talking about koyach and poel, potential and actual. So at that point, it doesn't yet have, if he reveals that, the details, as he says, are going to be still amorphous. They're not going to be defined. It's going to be like the pshitus of a nekudah, like the shapelessness of a dot. So even though the dot or the point has that potential when it's unpacked and dissected, but at that state of abstraction, though there are details, the details are going to be very, very, you could say, undefined. Aval imzeh, and yet at the same time, keeps going back, imzeh, and nevertheless, hine hanekudah hirak Metzius hadover bolvad. So now he's comparing Nekudah to Metzius. Remember, Metzius Kiyum Gilui. So he says, and yet, the Nekudah is only a Metzius dover levad. What does that mean? That all it is just the very existence of something, but it's not defined yet. Its Metzius is only that it's not the etzem. That's what he's referring to now. So Metzius, he means here in the context of only just the bare minimum of something has emerged. And Nekudah means when you have a yud, you can't say nothing is there. It's not nothingness. But you can't say there's a something there either, because it's only in a Nekudah form. Something has emerged as a Nekudah, and it's in a form that's still unshaped. Those shapes will come from it. So he's bringing it back to Nekudah being like Metzius. Only Be'efen Shlili Canal. In other words, you're saying it's not the source, but it's not the source. Like he said on the top of last page about Metzius, it's only not the Atzmi, but you can't call it yet something yet either. This needs to be a lot of explanation, obviously, but let me just read and then we'll go further. But that's what he's saying now. Umitziyuse hurak be'efen shlili kanal va'protim, and the details. Ima yesem gamkim pshutim, even though they are too in a shapeless form. Aval kvarem kayomim b'kiyum atzmi mashehem. So now he's moving to the next level. Va'protim. The details in that Nekudah. Looks like he's moving to Mishnah now, if I were to guess. Even though they too are relatively pshutim, meaning shapeless, but now they're kayomim b'kiyum atzmi mashehem. Now he uses kiyum atzmi. Now they're substantiated. They are now substantial. They've been established in a core type of establishment, whatever they are. Koloimer, shehem b'tzir mugbal, that means that they are in a defined shape. Shehem prote muskel mufshet. They're the details of this abstract idea. Mufshet zeh, shehem prote muskel mufshet zeh. They're the details of this particular abstract idea. El shehem adayim protim pshutim. But they're details that are still shapeless. And these details you can also explain in a number of ways. Yeah, it's clearly Mishnah in the context of Torah Shebiksav Mishnah. This is very similar to what we learned earlier about the Koyach HaTenua. Remember, he said a living entity is mobile. That's a Nekudah, not expressed. Then there's the general Klolin Protim. Remember, he said the head, the body, the legs, that each one of them has movement within them, different types. And then there's the actual movement of a specific. You use your hands to write an aleph and a beis. So he's going back the same idea here. Nekudah is just that there's something there that's not the source. That's the first tiyulia atzmi, what he used earlier. The second step is a kav, where there is now details, but the details still are not fully shaped. That's what he's saying right now. We have to go back to the moshel. So what does the moshel add? Koyach mufshat. It's afshata. He understands only the afshata. Okay. So what the difference? Okay. Yeah. Still have to explain how did this moshel come to help us understand the difference between level 1 and level 2, Nekudah and the Kav, Tersha B'Ksav and Mishnah. But let's finish and then I'll go back to it. Okay, so now the pratim, and this too you can explain in a number of ways. Why? Because they're not fully defined. The Mishnah itself, you see in the Gemara, the Amoraim argue what the Mishnah means. This one says it means this, one says it means that. How could you do that? Because it's not yet fully defined. Just as the Mishnah takes the Nekudah and turns it into some details, but the details still remain somewhat abstract. Okay. Shetach. Now he goes to level 3. And Shetach, the plane, who Gilui ha'er. Now he used the word Gilui. Before we talk Metzius, the bare minimum of a Nekudah. Kiyum is that it's now become established in details, but they're still not fully defined. Now comes Shetach, who Gilui ha'er. The revelation of the light, of the energy of the idea here. Sheba befrat ubemugbal. That comes in a very specific and defined way. Shehu ba'efen kach v'kach dafke. It's dafke this way. It's not open, maybe like this, maybe like that. This is the way it's defined. It's like the halacha of it, so to speak. I know you could say, what about the Gemara itself? People have different Rashi and the Rambam and Tosfos have different opinions in the Gemara itself. It's true. You could probably keep on going many levels. But in general, Tersha B'Ksav, Mishnah, and Gemara are these 3 stages. Nekudah Kav Shetach. Ukfar Hinehu. And now it's already become the Metzius Prati, a specific entity, a specific existent entity. And this is no longer mufshat. Ashuzulose seisrei. Another svara or another existence will contradict it. Seisrei. Remember we learned about being a Metzius that doesn't allow a seisrei, it negates another. Now it's become so defined, it no longer says, oh, you know what, we can see different angles to it, like we were able to do earlier stages. Now Zolosa says,
is that more like a cube?
No, a plane.
No,
not a cube, a plane.
But at this stage, it's going to be like even a 4th one, like a cube when they start.
Where do you see a 4th? He's talking about a plane.
I didn't see, that's why I asked.
No, Shetach. There's 3 things. Nekudah Kav Shetach. Point, line, plane. Which has, the plane is now a defined entity that Ashuluzulose Seisrei, another entity contradicts it. V'hu Seisr Luzulose, and it contradicts another. What means contradicts? Seisr means, not contradicts necessarily, it means it negates the other. In the world of Hafshata, like before, for example, a cell, before the chromosomes, male and female, are determined, it can go either way. But once it's determined, it's determined. Okay. This is it. He stops now. The next section is going to be the end of the Maimer. He's going to talk about the 3rd level of Bittul. So the Frierdiker Rebbe has concluded all his explanations in Ayin Beis, and now he's going to go to Efes Biltecha, the 3rd level of Bittul. So let's just sum this up and see if you have any questions. So a lot has been said here. He's essentially explained, let me go back and see how this all began. The 3rd level of Bittul was the level of Efes Biltecha, where you have the Metzius of Oyer, but there's no Metzius. That was the words. That with the 2nd level of Bittul, Ein Zuloscha, there you said, that Oyer exists, but it's completely aware that it doesn't have any existence of its own. It's completely dependent on the source, as opposed to level 1, where its existence is not dependent on its source. It's just nullified by the source, like a candle in the light of the sun. That's 1 and 2. 3, the words were, these words literally, even with Atzmus, there's only Atzmus. So even though there's Oyer, it's only Atzmus. So he asked the question, what does that mean? So he said, to explain it, we have to first explain the 3 Metzius Kiyum and Gilui, which is explained with the 3 levels of the way is encompassed in the source, the way reveals itself after the tzimtzum, but it's still somewhat amorphous, and then how Eris and Kalim become defined. And then he went back and said, so this, for now we can understand what the 3rd level of Bittul, which he's going to now explain in detail, because it's the level of Metzius. It's not, the only thing you can say about it, that it's not Atzmus, but you can't say there's something else. He said, that's Metzius. Then he came to explain that, I guess, in a little more, I don't want to use the word tangible, but in a little more defined way, that's Nekudah Kav and Shetach. That's what we've been learning here. So Nekudah is this level of Metzius, that there's something there, but it's still completely in a state of a point, which can go in so many different directions and can accept opposites. That's what a Seichel Mufshat is. That's why I gave the example of the wise person, who is I guess the Viyuvan Zeh. One second, let me just see something. Yeah, the Viyuvan Zeh goes on the entire subject. I thought he's coming to explain the difference between Mishnah and Teresh B'Ksav. He's coming to explain the whole idea that a person who's an abstract thinker, that abstraction gives us an understanding of what Nekudah is, because it starts with a very abstract state. It then moves into some details, and those details are still abstract, relatively speaking. Then it takes on shape and form. So this explains to us what it means, a state that in its most abstract form is Metzius or Nekudah. Kav has details, but they're still, like the Mishnah, not fully defined. And then Shetach is where it becomes defined, absolutely is this and not that. So in a sense, in the process of creation, it's like when the artist has a vision within his soul, he wants to create art, but he can create many types of art. And it's not yet determined which way. Someone says, did you determine which way you're going to express it? He says, no. But he knows the energy is there. He just hasn't determined in what form. Then he determines, but it's still not fully determined in detail. And then comes when actually creation, right before the creation process, you have the actual, it's going to be Chachma and Bina and Das and Chesed and Gvura. You go a step higher, it's still not fully defined until a point where you don't even have those details. It's all about the source expressing itself. That's essentially what we've learned. So if you really, once you bring it together, it makes total sense what we just discussed. And Frierdiker Rebbe gives a lot of examples of this hafshata. And the deeper, the higher you go, the less defined it is. The lower you go, the more specific it becomes. Yeah. Okay. Before I read on, it's already, okay, let me just, anybody has any questions on what we've just learned? Because the last piece is going to go back now to the Eifin HaGimel of Bittul, based on what we just learned. So any questions, any comments, anything you want to ask? Is it because I explained it so well, or because you're so confused you have nothing to say? Or both? No comments. You guys are so articulate at times.
So in our muscle here, when it says a pratim are also Peshutim, that's talking about the kav.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Teresh B'Ksav, Mishnah and Gemara is probably the easiest thing to understand in this context, because it's something we can all relate to most. So it's actually, I think that using that example can really help tremendously. Obviously, Eir HaKol Batzmusei, and the Eir HaKiyum and then Gilui, but it's the Rebbe gives us an emotional Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah, Psukim, Mishnah and Gemara. It's, I think, a very fascinating example.
So everything it goes Mila and Lamata, except for Bitlos, it goes Mata Lamila. Is that the way it is?
Avoida goes Mamata Lamaila. The Bittel is also a Mile Lamata. The highest levels of start the highest levels of Bittel. You're talking about when we work on ourselves, it goes that way, from the bottom up.
Right.
It really, I would say, it depends where you're beginning. If you start with the Yesh Amiti, the highest levels of Bittel are above. If you start from the Yesh Anivra, the lowest levels of Bittel are below, because we start from the bottom. Just simply what direction you're traveling. You know. It's also the difference in Torah and Tefillah, you could say. Torah draws down from a higher levels down, but I don't want to go there right now. That's not. Okay, look. There's a lot of details here. But here you see clearly that the Frierdiker Rebbe's style very stands out, and how, especially in contrast to Ayin Beis, because all this is explaining a half a page in Ayin Beis. Not even a half a page. Which is great.
We've become spoiled. How we're gonna make it without the Frierdiker Rebbe from now on, you know.
You have to say that the Rebbe at Alsbavardent, that I'm sure that they're giving us keiches to take it further. The Rebbe would never deprive us. You know, the fact that he stopped. But he will not deprive us, and I think maybe gave us enough to go with. And we'll have to do more work. Look, it's like the Rebbe said, Chav Ches Nisan 30 years ago. I did everything I can, now do something, now you do something. So we take the keiches.
He's the Hachamufla.
You can go a step further. When you finish Ayin Beis, what do you do next?
Baruch Hashem, we have a few years to go.
But then we could just learn Tanya, which is harder than everything.
He's saying Ad kan nimtzo mehemshech zeh. Ad kan nimtzo, that means there was after that also, but we didn't get it.
Well, yeah, but it's Eir HaKol Batz Musay, let's put it that way. Well, the Frierdiker Rebbe did stop writing and did stop speaking. So what do you expect the Rebbe to write here? Instead of Ad Kan Nimtzi, you should write that here, Kan Hifsik. You didn't want to write that. Okay. So let us stop here, my friends.